You can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. If this is your first time here, my name is Alara. This is not a place for advice or loud motivation. It's a quiet space for thoughts we rarely say out loud. If something here feels familiar, you're not alone. Let's begin. Sometimes you can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone. Not physically alone, but emotionally distant in a way that is difficult to describe. You are in a room filled with voices, laughter, and movement. Conversations overlap. People respond to each other effortlessly. You smile when expected. You participate when spoken to. From the outside, nothing seems wrong. Yet inside, there is a quiet separation between you and everything happening around you. You're present, but not fully connected. It feels like observing life rather than experiencing it. You are not sad. You are not angry. You simply feel slightly detached, as if there is a thin invisible layer between you and everyone else. This feeling rarely begins in the room itself. It usually starts much earlier, often in small, unnoticed moments. A time when you shared something meaningful and it did not land the way you hoped. A time when you spoke and felt unheard. A time when your thoughts were simplified, dismissed, or misunderstood. These moments are not dramatic. They're subtle. But subtle things repeated over time begin to change how you show up. You start adjusting. You share less. You reveal less. You become more careful, not intentionally, but protectively. Over time, that protection turns into distance, and distance turns into habit. One day, you realize that you can sit in a full room and still feel as though you are somewhere else entirely. Loneliness is often misunderstood. People assume it is the absence of others, but sometimes it is the absence of resonance, the absence of feeling seen in a way that feels real. You can have people around you and still feel unseen. You can have conversations and still feel unknown. When this continues long enough, your mind adapts. You begin to tell yourself that this is simply who you are, that you are naturally distant, naturally reserved, naturally different. But maybe that is not true. Maybe you are not distant. Maybe you simply learned to hold back in spaces where you did not feel fully understood. Connection requires vulnerability. Vulnerability requires safety. And when safety feels uncertain, control feels easier. So you control your words. You control your reactions. You control how much of yourself is visible. From the outside, you appear stable. But stability is not the same as closeness. And perhaps the real question is not why you feel alone in a crowd. Perhaps the better question is when you began to feel unseen. Because sometimes loneliness is not about the people around you. It is about the parts of you that no longer feel expressed. And noticing that may be the first quiet step toward reconnecting with yourself. Sometimes the most confusing part is that nothing looks broken. You have people around you. You have conversations. You are included. Yet something still feels slightly off. It is not dramatic enough to alarm you, not painful enough to demand attention. It is simply present. And because it is subtle, you learn to ignore it. You tell yourself that everyone feels this sometimes. That maybe you're just thinking too much. That maybe connection is supposed to feel this way. But deep down, there is a quiet awareness that something is missing. Not excitement, not noise, not attention. Depth. The kind of depth where you do not have to translate yourself, where you do not have to simplify your thoughts to fit the room, where your presence feels understood without constant effort. When that depth is absent, you adapt again. You become agreeable. You become efficient in conversations. You become socially functional. But functionality is not intimacy. And when intimacy is missing long enough, even full rooms begin to feel empty. So the next time you notice that subtle distance, do not rush to label it as weakness. Do not rush to blame yourself. Just notice it. Because sometimes the feeling of being alone in a crowd is not a flaw. It is a signal, a quiet reminder that you may be craving something more honest, more open, and more real than what is currently around you. There is another feeling people rarely admit: the need to appear strong. Not strong in a loud way, not strong in an impressive way, just unbreakable, capable, in control, handling everything. From the outside, it looks admirable. You are reliable. You manage your responsibilities. You do not collapse under pressure. People trust you. But strength can slowly turn into isolation. Because when you are always the strong one, people stop asking if you are okay. They assume you are fine. And over time, you start assuming it too. You stop sharing when you are overwhelmed. You stop expressing when something hurts. Not because you feel nothing, but because showing it feels unsafe. Maybe you learned early that vulnerability brings consequences. Maybe you felt dismissed before. Maybe you felt exposed. So you adjusted. You built a version of yourself that can handle everything quietly. You became composed, measured, controlled. And it works until it doesn't, because carrying everything alone slowly creates distance. Not from others first, but from yourself. You begin to ignore your own signals. Fatigue becomes normal. Stress becomes background noise. Emotional weight becomes something you push aside. You tell yourself you are just responsible, just mature, just independent. But sometimes independence is protection. And protection, if held too long, becomes isolation. The strong version of you may look stable. But stability is not the same as being supported. When was the last time someone truly checked in on you? Not about your tasks, not about your plans, but about how you feel. If you cannot remember, that might say something. Strength is not the problem, but the fear of not appearing strong can quietly disconnect you from people who might have been willing to understand. And maybe the real risk is not showing weakness. Maybe the real risk is never allowing yourself to be seen without armor. And sometimes, the pressure to stay strong becomes so normal that you no longer notice it. You become the one who listens, but rarely speaks about yourself. The one who supports, but rarely asks for support. The one who stays calm, even when something inside feels heavy. People admire that, but admiration can quietly replace understanding. Because when you always appear composed, others stop looking deeper. They assume you do not need space. They assume you do not need reassurance. They assume you do not need help. Over time, you may even start believing that you should not need those things. Needing support begins to feel like weakness. Expressing hurt begins to feel uncomfortable. You tell yourself that you can handle it, that you should handle it, that you have always handled it. And maybe you have. But handling everything alone slowly teaches your nervous system that connection is optional, that sharing is unnecessary, that silence is safer. The problem is not strength itself. The problem is when strength becomes your only visible layer. When the armor never comes off. When the composed version of you becomes the only version people ever see. Because beneath that armor, there is still a human being. A person who gets tired, a person who doubts, a person who sometimes wishes someone else would carry the weight. But if you never show that side, how would anyone know? So you continue. Capable, reliable, in control, yet quietly distant. And maybe the question is not whether you are strong. Maybe the question is whether you feel safe enough to be anything else. Because real strength is not the absence of vulnerability. It is the ability to allow it without feeling diminished. And if you have been strong for too long, perhaps it is not weakness you are avoiding. Perhaps it is the risk of being truly seen without protection. There is something else that quietly affects many people: the inability to be still. Not physically still, mentally still. Silence feels heavier than it should. Free time feels uncomfortable. When nothing is happening, something inside begins to move. Thoughts appear, not dramatic ones, just subtle questions. Is this really what I want? Why does something feel slightly off? Why do I feel restless when everything seems fine? These questions do not demand answers, but they demand attention. And attention requires stillness. So instead of sitting with them, you move. You open your phone, you check messages, you scroll without thinking, you start another task, you plan something new. It feels productive, it feels responsible, but sometimes it is not ambition. Sometimes it is escape. Because when you remove distraction, you are left with yourself, your unfinished emotions, your quiet doubts, your subtle dissatisfaction. Staying busy protects you from facing them. Movement becomes a shield, noise becomes comfort, and slowly you forget what stillness feels like. You confuse peace with boredom. You confuse silence with emptiness. But silence is not empty. It simply removes everything that keeps you from noticing what is already there. And that can feel overwhelming. So you continue moving. Not because you have to, but because slowing down feels unfamiliar. When was the last time you sat without doing anything? Without checking something? Without filling the space? For many people, stillness triggers discomfort. Not because something is wrong in that moment, but because stillness allows reflection. And reflection can uncover things you have been postponing: unmet needs, unresolved tension, unasked questions. When you are constantly busy, you never have to confront them. You can stay functional, efficient, occupied. But functioning is not the same as understanding yourself. And constant occupation slowly disconnects you from your own inner signals. You become good at reacting, but not at listening. You respond to life quickly, but rarely pause long enough to notice how it feels. The inability to be still is not laziness. It is often fear. Fear of what might surface when the noise stops. Fear of realizing that something needs to change. Fear of hearing a quiet truth you have been avoiding. And maybe stillness is not something to master. Maybe it is something to tolerate. Gradually, without forcing answers, without rushing to fix anything, just allowing space. Because sometimes clarity does not come from thinking harder. It comes from finally being still long enough to notice what has been there all along.